In 2015, our family was invited to join an event in a town called Weifang. There's so much to tell you about this story. So I have to first tell you about my family. It's very international. We're mostly Norwegian. Many of my family lived and worked in China. Many of my family lived and worked in Taiwan. My wife and I worked in Indonesia, therefore my batik shirt from Indonesia. So we're a very international family, and I grew up with the stories of my family. So I'm going to go back to World War II. The real part of this story is from 2015, but I have to preface it with World War II stuff. So in 1942, my aunt and two uncles and my grandmother got arrested in Yantai, Shantung, China, and sent into internment camp. So it's different than prisoner of war camp. Prisoner of war is for soldiers, but internment camp was for civilians. But when we say civilians, let me tell you, this internment camp in Shandong, it was in Weifang, Shandong. The actual county was Weixian, but in the city of Weifang, which is a small town in Shandong of 10 million people, there were 1,500 people put into this camp from 40 different countries. And it was crazy. The camp went from early, like February of 1942, to the summer of 1945, when World War II finally ended in the Asia region. So in the camp, those 1,500 people were supervised by not Japanese soldiers, but Japanese consulate officials. They were the foreign affairs officers or the State Department kind of people of the Japanese community. So it was a little bit better and nicer than the war camps that the prisoners of war got put into. But there was no supervision of how things were run. So the camp of 1,500 people from 40 nations had to come up with their own way to run a city. So there were like 15 committees. There was a Education for the Children Committee. There was a medical committee. There was a sanitation committee. There was a cooking committee. There was I don't know what they all were. There were lots of committees. My grandmother, Valborg, because she spoke Norwegian, Japanese, Chinese, and English, got put on one of the committees. One of the exciting things about this camp is an Olympic star from 1924 was part of the camp. Eric Liddell, after he won the gold medal in 1924 for the 400-meter sprint or race, left Scotland and went to China as a missionary and served amazingly in schools and in church planting in Tianjin and a lot of areas, doing an amazing work. And he was put in this camp as well. His wife and his children had already been sent to Canada. He saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, and got them out of China early, which a lot of people didn't do. So Eric Liddell was in the camp, or Liddell. Some say Liddell, some say Liddell. It's the guy in Chariots of Fire. If you have ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire, that's Eric. So he was in the camp. My grandmother, aunt, and two uncles were in the camp. My dad had made it out of China in the spring or in the fall of 41. He went to the foreign country of Brooklyn, New York, and so that was a different issue. These guys spent until 1945 in this camp. They had to run their own sanitation, everything. They ran it. And out of that, China's done two productions that I want to talk about. Two productions. One was a 5 DVD production about how the foreigners that were running this camp actually were amazing. They ran it like a small town, and they had a government that ran the whole camp because the Japanese only guarded the gate and provided supplies. That's all they did. And so the community there ran the camp. And there were people from everywhere. There were missionaries, there were diplomats, there were businessmen, there were prostitutes, there were people of every ilk in the camp, and it was crazy. How do you live with 1,500 people in a cramped quarter that was made for like 70 people and maintain sanity? 1945, they got freed. You know how they got freed? The war was over. The atom bomb had exploded over the two cities in Japan. The Japanese soldiers were scared out of their mind because they were diplomatic soldiers, not military soldiers. A plane flew over. It was a B-29. And that B-29 flew over, and then it flew real low and saw the camp. And then it went high, and it dropped 7 paratroopers who landed outside the gates of the camp. I have to add a little story here. Sorry, I love stories. In the early years, in 42 or 43, there were 2 18-year-old boys that escaped out of the camp. And everybody in the camp hated them because when these 2 boys escaped out of the camp, the Japanese soldiers got all mad because they looked bad that they let these 2 guys escape. And so they took it out on the rest of the people in the camp. And they made life hard, and everybody in the camp groused, oh, these guys, what were they thinking? They're just caring about themselves. They don't care about anybody else. Well, what they did is they trekked 1,000 miles across China to Chongqing, or wherever the military was based that was fighting against Japan. And they went and they reported that the camp with 1,500 international residents were at this location in Weifang. The county was called Weixian, but the big city nearby was Weifang. They reported, they gave directions, they showed on the maps where it was, and then they came back. And they moved into a village near the internment camp and lived there for the next 3 years, waiting for the war to end. When these paratroopers jumped out of their plane, he had told them, you don't need more than 6, maybe 7. We already have a security. When I talked about the city of 1,500 people having all their committees, one was a security committee. They had a security committee that scared the kajibers out of the Japanese troops. So when the atom bombs went off in Japan, the security forces in the camp were scared, and as soon as the plane flew over, they threw down their guns, and they moved away very quickly. And so these 7 guys jump out of the plane, 7 Americans and 1 Chinese. They had a Chinese there for translation. They landed, and if I remember right, the translator was 17 years old. He had never jumped out of a plane in his life. The Americans pushed him out because they needed him to help. And my Uncle Hawken, who was in the camp, said to this day, it was the best day of his life. They came and the 1,500 people, they just knocked down the gate and they went out to welcome the paratroopers. They carried him in on their shoulders, and the Japanese were gone. They were running for their lives in that situation. The poor 17-year-old Chinese guy, Ed Wang, he was trying to translate. No one needed him to translate because most of these people spoke Chinese and English and 40 other languages from their 40 countries. But the story I really want to tell you happened in 2015, just a few years ago. We got invited back to Weifang, actually to the county of Weixian, where the internment camp was. The Chinese had rebuilt the camp, remodeled it, and turned it into a museum to honor the foreigners who had put up with the Japanese invasion of China. And they had made a film about Eric Liddell, and it was called The Last Race. Eric Liddell had won the 1924 Olympic 400-meter race. And so this movie was called The Last Race. And in 2015, they invited us all to come to Weifang and to this museum and celebrate the new movie and to see the location that our ancestors have been. So anybody who was related to someone who had been interred in the camp was invited, and they would pay our hotel and our food. So our family, we've been living with the stories of the Weifang camp and the Shantung camp, they used to call it. And so we worked out to go. In the end, over 30 members of the Torgerson family showed up in Weifang. And the poor Chinese, they had a total contingent of 80 foreigners that showed up to come to this big event. And so it was a big deal. And there were banquets and programs and events. And so we're at the first day, and they're having a big banquet, and the director of foreign affairs is speaking, but he's having a hard time with his translator. So he asked us if anybody else could help translate. So I raised my hand and I said, I can translate. It'll be good English. It'll be terrible Chinese. But, he's speaking Chinese. I'm speaking English. We'll make it work. So I go up there, and he and I do this comedy act. The Chinese have a thing called duiyu. It's two guys or two people are talking, and they jab into each other. They just play this game where they're two comedians talking with each other. And this guy and I, this foreign affairs director for Shandong province, and I are just having a blast. We had a good time. So I started with this good feeling. At the end of that, I thought, okay, that was fun. I have never done that before quite like that. And I enjoyed it thoroughly. So I'm in a good mood. I get back down to my table at the end of that talk. And, I'm looking around the room to see who all is there, because there's friends that we know from the China world. They were missionary kids or third culture kids from China, or their parents were missionaries, or they themselves were missionaries, and they were diplomats, and there were different ones. And then in the very back of the room, there was a table with about 7 Chinese people and 1 Westerner. And I'm wondering, who is this poor guy? He's stuck here, and no one's talking to him, and no one's caring about him. And so, I'm feeling good. So I get up and I move to the back of the room and go to their table, and I talk Chinese to the Chinese people that are there. And then I look at the Westerner and I said, how are you doing? You're by yourself here. Can I help you at all with anything? Or are you doing okay? He said, yeah, I'm doing fine. This is good. And I said, well, I just wanted to welcome you here, that you're part of this community, and that you know a little bit about this internment camp that all our families were a part of. And we talked for a few minutes, and then I go back to my table. My son, Davin, at that time, knew many actors. I would like to say all actors. He could name them and every movie that had ever been in. He said, Dad, what were you just doing? I'm going, Davin, what are you talking about? He said, Dad, what were you just doing? Do you know who that was that you were just talking to? Well, he was a nice Westerner. He spoke English, and I just wanted to encourage him and thank him for coming. And he goes, Dad, that was Joseph Fiennes. His brother was Ralph Fiennes. That was in The English Gentleman. They're famous actors. I go, cool. I had no idea who he was. And so what it turns out is Joseph Fiennes was the actor that had been brought in by the Chinese movie companies to play the role of Eric Liddell in The Last Race, the movie that they were doing. And so later we talked and met a little bit, but, that intimidated me a bit. Partly the part that intimidated me most was that my son knew who he was, and I had no idea who he was. All right. So then the program goes on. I don't know if this is the first day or the second day, but now we're going to have a bunch of speeches. And the 3 people giving speeches. Now you need to know there are 80-some people at this that were guests, 80-some guests that were all descendants of people that were interred. But one of them was my Uncle Hawken, who actually found the room he had been put in, where his bed was. He found his prison room in the camp. And they asked him and Eric Liddell's 2 daughters to give speeches. Hawken was a diplomat, my Uncle Hawken. He had worked as the chief of mission, if you guys know State Department issues, that's just under the ambassador, for Laos during the Vietnam War. He did the first exchange of American soldiers with Vietnamese soldiers in Laos during the Vietnam War. He was an advisor to congressmen in D.C. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. So when he was asked to give a speech, he prepared 4 pages of notes of what his speech would be. And the Chinese said, we want to see it. And they deleted like a third of his speech, which talked about Eric Liddell's spiritual role and his family's missionary role. They didn't want anything of that in it. Then the 2 daughters of Eric Liddell, they also had to present their manuscript of their speeches, and they cut out everything that had anything to do with Christianity, the spirit, the church, their father's life. Their speeches were, politically correct, but very frustrating. Now, I at that point had lived in China for over 20 years. I'd worked in communities that were more conservative than Shantung. I was exploding inside. I was not happy. So, sometime after that event, they could tell I was angry. I was mad. I wasn't saying anything. But they put us on a bunch of buses, and they are taking us to a beachside resort where we're going to see clips of the movie, and we're going to be videoed as part of the promotion of the movie. And on the bus, I'm sitting next to the translator, who's also from the State Department or the Foreign Affairs Bureau. And she goes, why are you so angry? I said, that was the most ridiculous event you guys could have ever put on. You cut out the only important part of the talks of those 3 people, Eric Liddell's 2 daughters and my Uncle Hawken. Why in the world did you cut that out? They go, well, this is China. We're atheists. We don't support religion. I said, you are not atheists. Your constitution supports freedom of religion. And I live in a province which is more conservative than this province, and there's churches everywhere. And you have churches here in Shandong. And it's not atheist. Only a portion of your people are atheists. Many of them are believers in God. Why would you do such a stupid thing? And they go, what are you talking about? I said, if in America, my American friends that make movies would make a movie about Mao Zedong, and in that movie, they would never allow a word about communism to be mentioned, would that be an honest movie about Mao Zedong? And they're looking at me. No. I said, you have done a movie about Eric Liddell, and you aren't allowing a word about his faith to be mentioned. Eric Liddell didn't make a decision without his faith coming into place. They couldn't beat that argument. My wife was trying to calm me down. I was so angry because I've had to work in China, and I know China is way better than this. And this was just the dumbest movie that was ever made. And this is like 3-4 years later, and that movie hasn't gone anywhere. The Last Race. Try and look it up. You might find it. But it showed Eric Liddell as a person that was suffering under the Japanese. That was the purpose of the Chinese doing this film, because they don't like the Japanese. But they didn't mention his faith and his spiritual maturity and what he did for the Lord at all. So that bus ride, that helped me vent and helped me clarify in my mind what the issue was. Just being able to say, an American making a movie about Mao Zedong and never mentioning communism or what he did for China would have been horrific. It would have been insulting to the history of Mao Zedong, whether you like him or not. I want to honor my family that lived in that place. I want to honor the Chinese who are open to freedom of religion and allow the churches to keep on going in China. But I also want to talk to you about a guy named Langdon Gilkey, who wrote a book, Shantung Compound. Shantung Compound. If you like this story and you want to know more about that compound and what these 1,500 people lived through, which is the real story, with Eric Liddell, and he died 3 months before they were rescued from the compound of a brain tumor. If you want to read more about that, read the book Shantung Compound by Langdon Gilkey. It is amazing. I didn't read that until after I'd been to this event in Weifang. It is an amazing book on sociology. It's actually used in a number of universities as a sociological text. This story will mean so much more to you if you read that book. Find it, get it on Amazon.com or wherever you can find it, and read it if you want. It was amazing. Of the 80-some people at this event in Weifang, 30 were from our family. And the government officials asked us, how come most of the people here that are visiting as guests came from your family? I said, we love China. Our family grew up here. The other families, they love China too. But our family's been involved. And so don't play games with us. We know what's going on here, and you guys have a great country and you have a great policy, and these local officials were screwing it up royally. But most of China is not like that. And so want to encourage you, pray for China. Thank God that World War II is over, and now we're moving on to, lots of things going on internationally between our countries. And don't be surprised when there's lots of different things that happen. But go back to the book I mentioned, because when I talk about China, think about 40 nationalities of 1,500 people living in a very tight quarters for 3.5 years. How did they live? And how did they work it out? Read that book and see what the author says. Thank you very much for being in my home with me. It's good talking to you again.